take a look at executing the various baseline test cases that we created using the add user object. Here in this project we have the expanded baseline test cases using just a test step, the expanded baseline cases using the test step and the database validation, and the expanded baseline test cases using the transaction step instead of the test step. And you can see it's all the same 10 transactions that we looked at before, where we went through the details of what's actually created. So let's start at the top here. I have the baseline 1 test case open, which is just using the test step. And let's begin execution in the best place to do this to make sure it works, which is the ITR, which is the tool that you use to debug test cases, or to test them and debug them before you actually run them. So go ahead and execute the test case, and we can see right away it's already failed. Okay, so now we go through. If we pull this back here, we can see a little bit more. We take a look at why did this fail. And if we go to the test events, let's see if the assertion fired. The assertion did fire, and it says the actual response did not match the expected response. So we've got some information down here, but there's a easier way. Now that we see that some things aren't matching, we'll need to find out what those are. And then what we'll have to do is look at what that piece of information is and decide if we need to ignore it or if there's something else we need to do. So we can close this down. I'm going to go ahead and pause when I do this, but this is actually adding a user to the Lisa Bank environment. So that environment has to be deleted before I can rerun the test case, but I won't do that on the video here. I'll just do that behind the scenes. So real quickly, I'm going to go ahead and delete that user, then we can go through and examine this test case. Okay, I've got the user deleted, so I can dig into this test case and see why we got the failure, what's not matching. So we'll start off by executing the step, and we've got our response back, and then we can go to the assertion, and we can run the assertion, and we can see exactly where the two pieces of information are that are not matching. And as we look at this, these are IDs, and these IDs are being auto-generated by Lisa Bank. So we really don't have any control over these. No matter what we put in at the request, we're going to end up with something different. So we want to make sure that when the control and the test are being evaluated, that these two ID nodes are ignored. So we can click in here, right click, and choose to ignore both of them. And now we should be able to run this test case without the IDs bringing up a false, you could call it a false failure. So we'll go ahead and close this. Alright, now let's go ahead and run it in the ITR again and see how it goes. Remove the previous one, and everything is okay. So we can see the test events that the assertion evaluated, and it came back that the outcome is the same. So by choosing to ignore those two nodes, now we are actually able to do a true comparison of the actual and expected results. Now what's interesting to keep in mind here is that in the project config, there is a line here that's the configurations for the XML diff viewer is what this is for. So if we right click on this, you can see edit XML options, and it's already coming up on the ignored nodes. So we can see we've got some ignored nodes in here. So what this is telling the XML diff viewer to do is to go ahead and ignore certain items in the response when it makes a comparison. And in this case, it's going to be ignoring the IDs, the 4 of them, in the control and in the test sides of the assertion. So with these ignored nodes options in place, or configurations in place, we should be able to run these test cases now as a suite, and all of the test cases should pass. So let's go ahead and try that out. Close this, close the project config, go over to our suite document, right click on it, we'll run it on the registry, hit stage, and then I'll go ahead and pause it while it runs. And we can see here that all of the test cases have run now. The test suite is over, and the green light here, the green indicator, is telling us that all of them passed, so everything is good in the system. The baselines ran, and the add user object is functioning as it should based on the transactions that we've tested the system under test against. So I'll go ahead and close down this suite document, and now let's go ahead and we'll try out the test cases that are using the transaction step, which is the step that instead of having the simulator server invoke the system. It's going to have the agent invoke the system. So we should be good to go with the settings that we put in there so far to see if these are going to work. So let's go ahead and just run the test suite and see what happens. Go ahead and stage it and let it start running, and I'll go ahead and pause it. Okay, and as we can see here, same results as the previous run. All the test cases have come back with the green indicator saying that everything is okay with the add user object in the system under test. So all these passed, so everything is good. So we can go ahead and close this down, and let's look at the next collection of test cases, which are the test steps that are using the database validation step. Now, this one is a little bit different. It's got the test step in it, and we'll go ahead and open this here. And it also has the database validation steps, which are going to go through the response in a very granular manner and make sure that each piece is in fact in the database, and that while the response may have come back from the system saying that yes, here's all the information that was entered, this is going to actually validate that it is in the database for sure. So because this one's a little bit different, let's go ahead and run this one in the ITR before we try and run the suite. So open the ITR, we'll hit execute. Okay, looks like we have a problem here. The JDBC validation step has failed, or the test has failed, but there's something wrong with the JDBC validation step. So we can open this up, take a look at the test events, and let's see if we can see what we have here. Error connecting the server localhost on port 1529. Connection refused. Okay, so we should not have anything trying to use localhost. So this is saying that it's trying to connect to the system under test using localhost. So it is going to fail because we are on DT client right now. We're running this on the internal coordinator and simulator servers, the ITR does, which are on this DevTest client machine or DT client machine. And the system under test is actually on the app server. So if it's using localhost, it's trying to look here on the DT client machine when it actually needs to be invoking the app server machine. So more than likely this is going to be something that's in the project config. So let's take a look at the project config file. And we can see right here we have DB server on localhost. So if we look back at our test case and we look into the JDBC validation step, the first one, we've got a connection string which is JDBC connect URL. So this, if you remember, is being called from this data set. And the URL is over here. We'll just go into launch extended view, and we can see that it's using the variables DB server and DB port to connect to the system under test. And in the project config, the DB server is using localhost. So if we change this to app server, where the system under test is, we should be good. Go ahead and close this down. Save our test case. And again, in between the scenes, I am deleting all of these users each time I run this. So every time I run it, I have to delete the users from Lisa Bank to make sure the next test runs correctly, because it's going to put the same data in, and if it's already there, it's going to error out. So everything's cleaned up, good to go. Let's go ahead and give it another shot here. Open the ITR, clear that out, and go ahead and hit execute. Okay, and we can see the test is done, and all of the steps have successfully completed. The gray means that there were no failures here, so everything executed as it should. So the add user object ran, the assertion ran, everything was good there. Then all the JDBC steps went through in the granular fashion. All the JDBC steps went through and validated the responses in a very granular way, and everything is okay there. So we should be okay to actually run the test suite now and see that everything comes through with green lights. Okay, so we'll go ahead, right click on the suite, run it, stage it, and I'll pause it while it's executing. Okay, so here we go. The test case is done executing. We've got green lights all the way down the column. So everything is working as it should be. Now let's jump back to the project config for a minute and talk about the local host, the value for DB server. So how did that happen? So we had to change this to app server from local host. And the reason why local host was placed here is because within the application itself, it is using local host. It's hard coded into many of the URLs it's using to make calls. So CA Continuous Application Insight is grabbing that data that's in there, and it sees the local host and it's putting it here because that is what the system under test is actually using. So that is how localhost wound up here. What's important to note through all of this is that there's going to be a few little things you're always going to have to work on a little bit after you generate the test cases, and then you get that dialed in, and once they're all set up, they can run and they can provide the regression testing you need. So you may have to do some slight modifications once you generate the test cases to get them to run successfully. And on the other side, there's opportunities to potentially work with what you're capturing in CA/CAI and make sure that it is getting the data over here the way you want it. So there's a little bit of tweaking that can happen on both sides, but in the end, with a few little adjustments, you can get these test cases to do what they are supposed to do, which is to do regression testing.